Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We're back now with Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, who is going to be asking some tough questions of that next nominee to be the VA Secretary. Senator, the VA says that the average wait time at some facilities can be as long as 100 days. President says he's not happy with the speed of reform there. What is the source of this problem?
Well, look, the VA is the largest integrated healthcare system in the country. And as I said previously, if you ask the veterans organizations, they by and large think the VA is providing good quality care. You know, Margaret, there is a lot of attention paid to the VA because it's a government agency. But I got news for you. People all over this country, when they want to get to a doctor, they need hospital care, they don't get in the very next day. So I am sure that there are some VA facilities where the waiting time is too long. That has got to be addressed. There are other VA facilities, for example, I know here in Vermont, that if you are dealing with a psychiatric crisis, an emotional crisis, you get in that day. That's pretty good. So the VA does a lot of good things. It has problems. We have got to improve the VA. But I think we've got to listen to the veterans of this country and not privatize it.
Senator, you also sit on the Environment Committee, and you've been a harsh critic of EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. He's facing a number of questions about ethics and these new reports that he rented a residence here in Washington, partly owned by the wife of a top energy lobbyist whose firm did business with the EPA. Do you think your committee should hold hearings on this?
I do, but I think the issue goes well beyond that problem. The issue goes to the fact that the vast majority of people in this country understand that climate change is real. It is already doing devastating problems throughout our nation and throughout the world. And yet we have a president and a head of the EPA who do not even recognize the reality of climate change, let alone the need to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. So you got a guy who's head of the EPA now who is nothing more than a front man for the fossil fuel industry. And that is a very serious problem. And the Congress has got to stand up and oppose that line of policy.
I imagine you oppose the lowering of emissions standards that the administration is expected to announce this week.
Well, of course. I mean, what we have got to do is understand that we have, over the last number of years, made success against air pollution and against water pollution. We have made some success in transforming our energy system. And the idea to go back and listen to the short-term needs of the coal industry or the oil industry makes no sense to me at all. Look, here is the truth. What the scientific community is telling us is that climate change is one of the great environmental crises facing this planet. And if we don't get a handle on that, we're going to be leaving this a planet to our kids that is not healthy or habitable. We've got to address that. The Trump administration is moving in exactly the wrong direction.
Sir, you have been critical of the Israeli government's decision to use lethal force against Palestinian demonstrators, killing 15, wounding over 700. The Trump administration has stopped short of calling on Israel for restraint. Should they explicitly do so?
Yes, they should. Look, Gaza, as I think everybody knows, is a humanitarian disaster. The unemployment rate there is beyond comprehension, and there is just enormous unrest. What the function of the United States government should be right now is to sit down with the Israelis, sit down with the Palestinians, and figure out how we can rebuild Gaza. And also to tell the Israelis that when you've got tens and tens of thousands of people protesting, they cannot overreact. And the idea of 15 or so people being killed and hundreds being wounded is to me, unacceptable.
We should note the Palestinian Authority did boycott a meeting at the White House recently to talk about rebuilding Gaza. Senator, thank you so much for your time. We'll be right back with our political panel. And now for some political analysis. Michael Crowley is senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico. Shauna Thomas is the Washington bureau chief for Vice News. David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic. And David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Thanks for being here on the holiday. Shauna, the president out tweeting this morning about immigration. He says no more DACA deal. What is happening?
Well, number one, there wasn't really much of a DACA deal left. I think you can see, especially from the appropriations process and the omnibus, that the Democrats didn't push it. The Republicans don't seem to have a way to get there. And also, it's in courts, basically. So I think he's pretty safe in saying there's no DACA deal because there wasn't a DACA deal. I think the other interesting thing is he said that they need to go to the nuclear option, which we have heard the president say, which is getting rid of basically the filibuster in Congress, in the Senate. And this is also something that Senator McConnell has said, I'm not for that. So I think this is stuff we've heard from the president before, and this is how he's spending his Easter.
What's interesting, too, I think, is that with no DACA deal, it wasn't just Democrats that lost something in protecting younger undocumented immigrants, these dreamers, but also the president. He only got the $1.6 billion for his border wall. He knows it. I think there's his conservative base is eager for him to get started. And as much as they pitched the idea that they're going to use that money to get started on some of the wall immediately, the president's frustrated he didn't get more of the wall. And I think now it's going to be a political issue come this fall. And I think he's sort of trying to set the groundwork that he wants to move forward as hard as he can on tougher immigration.
And David, yes. The president linked this as well to the future of the free trade deal with Mexico and Canada.
Well, the president is revealing to many of his supporters the true cost of Donald Trump's own presidency for things they believe in. What triggered the president's tweets was a comment on Fox and Friends this morning about what has been an emerging issue in the conservative press, a movement of some hundreds of people from Central America through Mexico, unchecked by Mexican authorities, hoping to get to the United States border and then to make a request for asylum. It reminds us of the rushes to the border from Central America in the summers of 2014 and 2015 that were triggered by President Obama's DACA executive orders. He made it clear that it was going to be easier to stay in the United States, and many thousands of people left Central America to try to take advantage of that. That was brought to an end with the cooperation of Mexican law enforcement. Mexico is must be a partner in defending the country against illegal immigration. If you alienate Mexico over the wall and over NAFTA, what you end up doing is electing this summer a much more nationalistic, much more radical Mexican president who will not cooperate. And these rushes to the border, which Trump is railing against, will be a cost of the Trump presidency.
And this isn't the only trade deal that the president has linked this week to other issues facing this country. The president also, Michael, threatened this free trade deal with South Korea that many in the White House thought they'd settled if they don't do or go along with what he's asking for with North Korea.
Yeah, he boasted that he had leverage over South Korea at this point as we head into these incredibly sensitive negotiations with North Korea. It seems like he's still on track to meet with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, in May. But you would think that at this time, the U.S. and South Korea would be hugging each other closely, trying to have a unified strategy in front, show the North Koreans that you can't divide up America's alliances in the region, and instead Trump has chosen this opportunity to go after them economically, to renegotiate a trade agreement. Interestingly, I think that some of the concessions he's gotten from the South Koreans, I've seen compliments from unexpected quarters. He may be feeling as though that he's onto something here, and he may be feeling like he can push it farther, and that he's going to use this moment for economic gain as well as security gains. But it is very counterintuitive that you would be pressing the South Koreans at such a critical strategic moment on economic issues.
David Nakamura, the joint exercises with South Korea go underway today. They had been delayed to accommodate the Olympics. Yep. That was also a little bit of a give to North Korea as well.
But I think what this administration is trying to signal is that if Donald Trump does have some coordinated strategy, there's a lot of people who don't believe it, but that they've learned from mistakes in the past in potential negotiations with the North, and that is maybe easing up on some of the military cooperation with South Korea or the hardline sanctions that have been imposed. And this administration has gone farther on sanctions unilaterally and through the United Nations. They're pledging to keep all of these things in place throughout any negotiations until the North shows some specific examples of actually moving toward denuclearization. That's a big if and well down the line, but I think you're seeing a lot of people say we need to keep the pressure on, this maximum pressure idea, well through the negotiations.
The administration's one strategic idea is it's easier and in the short run cheaper to kick your friends than to kick your enemies. So it's easier to kick South Korea than it is to do anything about North Korea. It's easier to bully Mexico than to work on actually getting Mexican help to harden the U.S. Mexican border. And that appeals to Trump's instincts, but to describe any of this as a strategy, I think is just a fundamental categorical error. What you have are a series of impulses that are that are driven by the search for weakness and the desire to humiliate.
But there's no, I mean, the problem is we are isolating China to a certain extent with our conversation about trade. We are, in some ways, this isolates South Korea, who we know is going to meet with the North Koreans before we meet with the North Koreans. The Chinese met with the North Koreans before we met with them. It confuses the situation a lot. But, you know, I could say that about almost everything that comes out of the Trump administration, that the rest of the world is confused.
Isolating China was strategy. That's why we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the effort to build Pacific arrangements that could weaken China, contain China, and enhance American strength. What you now have are, slaps at South Korea, who one of America's most important potential and maybe former friends in the region.
And also Japan.
And Japan, yeah.
Right. I mean, Japan. I mean, if there's any world leader that's really tried to sort of get close to Trump, it's Prime Minister Abe in Japan.
He's coming here soon.
Yes, he's coming to try to talk about North Korea and set some guardrails because the Japanese are concerned about this negotiation. But I think that the Japanese have seen the risks of closing up too much to Trump.
On Russia, Michael, this was a pretty significant action by the White House. They said they expelled not diplomats, but Russian undeclared intelligence officers. Russia took another action in response. Were you surprised to see this kind of escalation?
I was a little surprised, particularly because it came on the heels of President Trump calling President Vladimir Putin to congratulate him on his re-election in an election process that was widely seen as anti-democratic and basically a sham. I think Freedom House described it as a sham, so did Senator John McCain. President Trump called Putin, and I think as David may have been one of the co-bylines on The Great Story, saying that Trump had ignored talking points that were handed to him saying, do not congratulate Putin. But I think what has become increasingly clear is that there is sort of a two-track American approach to Russia. There is the Trump administration, which has actually been taking some relatively tough measures. I think a step that didn't get enough attention was Trump's decision to sell anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, which was a proposal that President Barack Obama always feared would be a dangerous escalation in the conflict in Ukraine. And
his national security team emphasizes that.
Absolutely. They were very pleased by that. But then at the same time, you have President Donald Trump himself, who continues to try to reach out to Putin, to befriend Putin. And Trump has this logic, supposedly, that says you can have a tough fist policy-wise, but extend your hand personally to try to somehow find some kind of common ground. And I think we just have to live with that reality and see where it takes us.
The Russian media reporting, and it has not been contradicted here, that while 60 individuals were expelled, that the quota of Russians who are allowed to be in the United States has not been reduced. Right. And so it is so that 60 people will go, 60 new people will come. So it's not as tough a measure at all as it looks.
Russia's cap on our diplomats was different. David, I want to ask you, this is not the first time that the president seems to be at odds with his national security team. Right. The Syria announcement, withdrawing 2,000 troops suddenly.
Right.
This caught many by
surprise, including the Pentagon, I think, and other advisors who've said that's the worst thing you can do, that you may have had some success in defeating ISIS and taking their territory, but you're setting conditions for their reemergence or reemergence of another extremist group if you leave too early. Some even point to Barack Obama having withdrawn troops from Iraq and setting a stage for ISIS to take land in that country.
That was a campaign talking point.
Yeah, it was, but Trump campaign hard against terrorism, and I think he also sees, though, the idea that our military are on endless missions around the world as a flaw of previous administrations on both sides of the aisle. So I think that hits his instinct to withdraw troops, but to do it in the way he did it at a campaign rally, get maybe applause lines without setting the stage with your national security cabinet and going against their advice does not make sense. You're right. The same way he also sort of accepted this negotiation with North Korea and a face-to-face meeting with Kim Jong-un just sort of surprised everybody in the way he came out with that. I think it's a hard way to run your national security team.
Go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the things people haven't focused on as much is that right after he said the Syria thing in Ohio, he also complained about the trillions that we've spent in the Middle East, that we could spend money more on schools here if we didn't spend those trillions in the Middle East. And it sort of had me thinking that, what does that say to our military? What does that say about what they're doing, the job that they're trying to carry out, the ability to try to get Syria back to some attempt at stability. And I was also struck because we had someone die in Syria.
Yeah.
Master Sergeant Jonathan Dunbar from Austin, Texas,
Exactly.
died of an IED on the same week that Trump is saying these things. And
And freezing funding that is used to move
exactly, 200 million.
unexploded ordnance. We have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much to talk about, as always, with all of you. I'd like to thank our panel for coming in on the holiday, and we'll be back in a moment. We sat down recently with United Nations High Commissioner Filippo Grandi. He is the UN's top official on refugees, tasked with providing them protection, distributing aid, and managing resettlement programs. His organization has identified over 65 million displaced people worldwide. We spoke with him about 3 major refugee crises: Muslims fleeing Burma and crossing into neighboring Bangladesh, Syrians trying to escape conflict inside that country, and Congolese fleeing violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're in the midst of the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Do you have the resources you need?
Not enough, not enough. And not only that, but we need, of course, humanitarian resources to address the basic needs: food, medicines, shelter, protection, especially for the most vulnerable, women, children. But we increasingly need, with this protracted crisis, the average stay of a refugee in a foreign country these days is maybe 15 to 20 years. So you
15
need
to 20 years in a
Yes.
refugee camp.
Or in refugee camp, or in refugee situations. This is the nature of the crisis today.
Now, in terms of political leadership, the president has capped the number of refugees that the United States will resettle here on the U.S. mainland at about 45,000 for 2018. Does that concern you to see those kind of caps?
We are discussing this matter with the U.S., and we hope that once this analysis of the vetting procedure is completed, once measures are taken to make it even more robust, although we think it's quite robust already, then we can talk about larger figures again.
I want to ask you about some specific cases. In Burma, these are 700,000 people who flooded into Bangladesh, which is itself one of the poorest countries in the world.
Not only poor, but I visited there a couple of times. The area of Bangladesh where they have flooded in is extremely exposed to climate phenomena like monsoon rains, like typhoons, like flooding. So it's a very fragile area from the environmental point of view.
You see the images from that area and food scarcity. You see men clamoring for bags of rice. Infants, babies, dead in their mother's arms because of what they've fled just to get to these camps. Are you hearing any advocacy from the United States on this issue? I mean, who do you even meet with in the Trump administration?
Well, the people in the State Department that are responsible for refugee assistance have been very active.
And there's no one running that program right now because there hasn't been someone appointed.
But the office, the professionals, the officials that are staffing the office have been working very hard on the response. It's not a very well-known population, it's not a very well-known cause, but I think there is growing sympathy and support worldwide, and at least that can help in the response. But we need to find a solution, and that's the most difficult, back in their country, back in Burma.
In Syria, we're just past the 7th anniversary of that war. Is the refugee flow slowing down at all?
The refugee flow has, meaning people exiting Syria into the neighboring countries, has slowed down a while ago because the borders are practically closed. And Europe having closed borders 2 years ago, this has provoked a chain reaction. So
there's nowhere to run.
So for Syrians, there's nowhere to run outside the country, except for a few of them. We've seen, on the other hand, and because of that, a big increase in internal refugees.
Diplomatically, there's no solution to that in sight. But do you feel there's a global fatigue when it comes to donating or when it comes to support for these refugees?
There might be, and it's also a matter of sheer numbers. I have to travel the world, go to donor capitals, and every time bring a new situation which requires funding. But what can I do? I often say that we have become unable to make peace.
You're going, as you said, to political capitals, sort of door to door, asking for help for all of these crises. How do you prioritize Africa? Where does that fall?
It's difficult because Africa is far away. You know, Africa is the continent that is perhaps the furthest away from the rich countries. And in an era of mobility, when refugees become visible when they come at the doorstep of rich countries, it's more difficult for people who don't get to that doorstep and remain refugees or displaced far away.
They're not seen.
They're not seen, they're invisible. And Africa has never been at the center of the strategic interest of the big powers, unfortunately, although of course there are many important interests there as well. So it is more difficult to make the case for African refugees, but I would argue that it should be equally compelling. I think it's a fundamental message that I'd like to leave behind for those who listen, those who watch, is remember that refugees are not a threat and should not be seen as a threat. Refugees are people that are fleeing from unimaginable threats.
So that must frustrate you when you hear the president only speak about refugees in the context of a national security threat.
What I say does not mean that governments do not have a responsibility to ensure that population movements, including refugees, do not bring insecurity. This is a sovereign duty of any country. That's why we support vetting, we support controls. But fundamentally, if somebody is assessed as being a refugee, he or she should be received, should be given that protection that this person has lost in his or her country. And in countries like the United States, should be given the opportunity to thrive, like millions of refugees have done in the past few decades.
But it's not easy to be resettled in the U.S.
Well, it is still the largest resettlement program in the world. And like I said, once this issue of vetting has been clarified, I hope that the figures can rise again.
No promises yet on that?
Ongoing discussion.
We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. We hope you have a happy Easter and Passover. And until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.